You're not crazy. You're not needy. You're not too much. You're just stuck, chasing people who run the moment you get close. And guess what? There's a reason for that. You are magnetically attracted to avoidance, and not in a good way. So today, I'm going to tell you exactly why that keeps happening and the one shift you can make starting today that will completely change the way you show up in relationships. Let's go. You're not too much. You're not broken. You're not the reason people pull away. That feeling of being rejected, of always wanting more closeness than the other person is willing to give, isn't a flaw in you. It's a signal that you've been stuck in a pattern that started long before this relationship, maybe even before you were old enough to understand it. Attracting emotionally unavailable or avoidant partners isn't random. It's not bad luck. It's a reflection of how you've learned to relate to love. For many people, especially those who attract avoidance, there's a history of having to earn love in their earliest relationships. That could mean growing up in a household where love was conditional, where affection only came when you were well behaved, helpful, successful, or invisible. It could mean having emotionally distant or inconsistent caregivers, where expressing your needs didn't lead to comfort but to guilt, silence, or rejection. So, what do you do when you learn early on that connection comes at a cost? You adapt, you become the caretaker, the fixer, the one who anticipates everyone else's emotions, who keeps the peace, who reads the room before you even enter it. You learn to prove your worth by working for love because that's the only version of love you were shown. Fast forward to adulthood, and now you're in relationships where you're constantly giving. You text first. You forgive too easily. You overlook red flags and call it compassion. You feel anxious when they pull away, so you double down, more effort, more vulnerability, more trying to prove you're safe and worthy. And each time they withdraw even more. But you don't see that as a sign to stop. You see it as a sign that you're not doing enough. This is how the cycle continues. And what makes it even harder to break is the fact that it feels so familiar. The chase, the anxiety, the emotional high of finally getting a response after being ignored for days, it all mimics the patterns your nervous system has come to associate with love. In reality, you're not chasing the person in front of you. You're chasing the emotional resolution you never got as a child. This is what people mean when they say we recreate our earliest wounds in adult relationships. It's not a conscious choice. No one wakes up thinking, let me fall in love with someone who can't meet my needs. But your subconscious is drawn to what's familiar, not what's healthy. If inconsistency was your norm, then stability feels boring. If emotional distance was part of your upbringing, then closeness can feel overwhelming, even though you crave it. The good news is that none of this is your fault, but all of it is your responsibility to heal. When you start to recognize these patterns for what they are, survival strategies, not your personality, you gain the power to change them. Affirm. I choose to see. I choose to feel. I choose to change. I choose to pursue. I choose to change it all. With mindset, with purpose, with action. If you can find the power to pivot and move out, new things can happen. If you can find the power to change things, you can change your life with purpose, with intention. You begin to see that you're not needy, you're human. You're allowed to want consistency. You're allowed to need reassurance. You're allowed to stop working so hard for the bare minimum. And most importantly, you learn that being too much for someone who is emotionally unavailable says nothing about your worth. It only highlights their limitation. When you start showing up fully for yourself, when you stop twisting into emotional pretzels to keep someone around, you naturally begin to repel avoidance. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because you're no longer willing to play a role in their emotional avoidance. You weren't meant to beg for love. You weren't built to chase it. You were meant to receive it fully, freely, without earning it. And that starts the moment you realize that this pattern is not who you are, it's just who you've had to be until now. Avoidant individuals are not drawn to people who make them feel safe or secure. They're drawn to people who do the emotional work for them. And if you're someone who's constantly reaching out, initiating conversations, trying to resolve conflict, and giving without receiving much in return, chances are you've been that person, the overfunctioner, the emotional caretaker, the one who holds the entire relationship together while the other person stays distant, vague, or unavailable. This dynamic isn't random, it's a pattern. Avoidants tend to form connections with people who unconsciously enable their fear of closeness. When you do all the emotional lifting, when you express your feelings first, make space for their hesitations, excuse their inconsistent behavior, and keep trying to prove that you're safe to love, you make it incredibly easy for them to stay emotionally detached. You create a structure that allows them to benefit from connection without having to face the vulnerability that true intimacy requires. And here's the difficult truth. Being that emotionally available, highly attuned person can seem like a strength. It looks like compassion. It looks like loyalty. But when you're paired with an avoidant, it becomes an imbalance. You lean in, they lean out. You bring closeness. They create distance. The more effort you give, the more space they take. And before you know it, you're exhausted, confused, and blaming yourself for not being enough to make them open up. But you're not the problem. The problem is the invisible contract you've entered into. It goes something like this: I'll manage the emotional connection for both of us. I'll be strong, patient, understanding, and low maintenance if you'll just stay. And in that agreement, your needs get buried. You silence your discomfort to maintain the illusion of intimacy. You stop asking for more because deep down, you believe that asking will push them away. And in many cases, it does, because avoidants are uncomfortable with demands. They fear being consumed or needed too much. So they gravitate toward people who give without asking, who love without needing, who stay quiet even when they're hurting. This isn't about blame, it's about clarity. Avoidants don't set out to hurt anyone. Most aren't even fully aware of the patterns they're playing out. They've learned to protect themselves by keeping emotional distance, often because they too were let down or overwhelmed in early relationships. But the moment someone gets too close, their alarm bells go off. Intimacy feels like a threat, not a reward. And so without consciously intending to, they back away just enough to stay connected, but never enough to feel truly seen. If you're the one holding all the weight, you may think you're keeping the relationship alive, but in reality, you're enabling emotional avoidance. You're giving so much space for their fears that there's no room left for your truth. And over time, that dynamic starts to erode your sense of self. You start shrinking in hopes that they'll move closer. You trade in your needs for crumbs of connection. You tell yourself this is love, but it's not. It's performance. It's emotional labor masquerading as devotion. What avoidants need, if they ever choose to grow, is a partner who refuses to carry both sides of the emotional equation. A partner who says, I'm here, but I won't chase you. A partner who holds space for intimacy, not just in words, but in action. When you stop overfunctioning, when you stop managing their emotions at the cost of your own, you disrupt the pattern. You show them that love isn't about disappearing into someone else's fear. It's about meeting halfway or not at all. And in doing so, you start to attract something completely different. Not relationships where your value is measured by how little you need, but ones where your presence, your needs, and your emotional clarity are seen as strengths, not threats. You stop being attractive to avoidance, and you start being magnetic to people who are actually ready to meet you where you are. When you feel an intense spark with someone who pulls away, who's emotionally distant or inconsistent, It's easy to call that chemistry, the butterflies, the longing, the high when they finally respond. It all feels so powerful and real. But what most people don't realize is that what we often label as chemistry is actually our nervous system reacting to something deeply familiar, not necessarily something healthy. That feeling of electricity with someone avoidant isn't just attraction, it's a trauma response. This can be hard to accept because the connection feels so genuine. There's a rush of emotion when they give you attention and a crash when they retreat. You start to feel hooked, obsessing over what you said, what went wrong, what you can do to fix it, and it all feels like love. But the truth is, it's more like emotional whiplash. You're not bonding with who they are. You're bonding with the emotional highs and lows they create. This kind of intensity usually comes from unresolved attachment wounds. If you grew up with love that was inconsistent, conditional, or unpredictable, your nervous system learned to associate emotional instability with connection. Maybe one parent was present sometimes and distant at others. Maybe love was earned through good behavior, silence, or caretaking. Either way, you were trained to stay hyper-aware, to watch for signs of rejection, and to equate effort with worth. Fast forward to adulthood, and when someone avoidant shows up, someone who gives you just enough to keep you invested, but never enough to feel secure, your subconscious recognizes the pattern, and instead of running away from it, you run toward it. Not because it's good for you, but because it feels like home. That tension between closeness and distance is familiar, and familiarity, even when it's painful, can feel intoxicating. It's important to understand that avoidants often trigger a cycle that mirrors addiction. They give just enough to make you feel seen, then withdraw, creating a vacuum. Your body responds with anxiety and longing, and when they return, even briefly, it brings a rush of relief. This cycle floods your brain with chemicals: dopamine when you reconnect, cortisol when they leave, adrenaline when you anticipate the next move. It keeps you in a loop of craving, withdrawal, and reward. And just like with addiction, the more inconsistent the reward, the more hooked you become. That's why it's so difficult to walk away from someone who clearly can't meet your emotional needs. You're not just dealing with disappointment, you're battling a chemical and emotional storm. You tell yourself that this time it'll be different, that they'll change, that if you can just love them better or communicate more clearly, they'll finally meet you where you are. But the truth is, no amount of effort can compensate for someone's lack of emotional availability. Once you start seeing this dynamic for what it is, not fate, not love at first sight, but a reenactment of early wounds, you begin to take your power back. You begin to understand that healthy love doesn't feel like a roller coaster. It doesn't come with confusion, anxiety, or a constant fear of abandonment. Real intimacy feels safe, grounded, and calm. It might not give you the same adrenaline rush, but it won't leave you doubting your worth. Healing starts when you learn to recognize the difference between chemistry and compatibility, between intensity and intimacy, between someone who activates your wounds and someone who nurtures your growth. The person who makes you feel crazy with uncertainty isn't your soulmate. They're your mirror, showing you where you still need to heal. And when you choose to walk away from that familiar chaos, when you choose peace over patterns, you stop confusing pain for passion, you stop chasing what hurt you, and start attracting what can actually love you. So that's not just healing, that's freedom. There's a common belief that being attractive in relationships means being easygoing, low maintenance, and endlessly forgiving. That if you're kind enough, patient enough, or loving enough, the other person will eventually choose you, stay consistent, and love you back the way you need. But this mindset is exactly what keeps people stuck in one-sided dynamics, especially with avoidance. The truth is, what truly makes you magnetic isn't how much you give, it's how clearly you define what you will and won't accept. It's your boundaries, your standards, your ability to honor yourself, even when it's hard. When someone pulls away, gives mixed signals, or avoids emotional closeness, it's tempting to lean in further, to over-explain, over-accommodate, and shrink your needs in the hope that doing so will keep the peace. But that never works. Not long term. The more you mold yourself around someone else's avoidance, the more invisible you become. And invisibility doesn't attract respect. It attracts more distance, more silence, more confusion. What actually stops an avoidant pattern in its tracks is when you stop managing the relationship and start managing yourself. When you stop trying to earn love and start expecting it to meet you where you are. That doesn't mean you become cold or guarded. It means you become rooted. You stop making excuses for inconsistent behavior. You stop rationalizing crumbs as connection. You start telling the truth about what you feel, what you want, and what you will no longer tolerate. This is where boundaries come in. Boundaries are not walls to keep people out. They are doors to show people how to walk with you. They communicate what's okay and what's not, without drama, without blame. And when you express them with clarity and calm, you signal to others, I know my worth. I know how I deserve to be treated, and I'm not afraid to walk away if that standard isn't met. That energy is powerful. It shifts dynamics instantly. People either rise to meet you or remove themselves entirely. Either way, it brings clarity. Standards go hand in hand with boundaries. Standards are not demands. They are reflections of how you've chosen to value yourself. If your standard is emotional availability, consistency, and open communication, then someone who disappears when things get real can no longer be an option. When you embody that, when you refuse to settle for less just to have something, you start attracting partners who are ready for what you're ready for. Not because you convinced them, but because you stopped convincing yourself that you needed to earn what should be mutual. What makes you truly attractive is the way you own your emotional experience without apology. When you can say, I want depth, I want connection, and I won't chase someone who's unsure of me, you shift from proving your worth to living in it. That's not being too much. That's being honest. And that honesty is magnetic, not just to the right partners, but to your own self-respect. People often think they need to do more to be chosen, but the truth is, the less you abandon yourself, the more aligned your relationships become. When you stop managing someone else's comfort and start protecting your own peace, you naturally weed out those who aren't capable of true intimacy, not through conflict, but through clarity. Self-awareness is the key to raising your vibration. I can't recommend it enough. When you start to trust your own behavior, it's the first thing that disarms them. When you start to trust your own desires, not someone else's desires, not someone else's defectiveness, not someone else's dysfunction, but your own depth and clarity, you don't have to beg for love. You don't have to perform for affection. You don't have to shrink to be held. You just have to stand in your truth, speak your needs, and trust that the right people won't be scared off by your fullness. They'll be drawn to it, because the moment you stop betraying yourself to be loved is the moment love starts to feel real. There's a moment in every one-sided relationship where the pain of holding on becomes louder than the fear of letting go. That's the moment your power starts to return. Not because the other person finally shows up, but because you finally realize you don't need them to. When you're caught in a cycle with someone avoidant, it's easy to believe that they hold all the power. They decide when to engage, when to withdraw, when to respond, and when to go silent. You're left reacting, waiting, overthinking, and hoping. But here's the truth. You've never actually been powerless. You've just been giving your power away. The moment you stop waiting for them to choose you is the moment everything begins to shift. You stop bending your boundaries just to stay close. You stop second-guessing your needs just to keep things comfortable for them. You stop performing for love, and instead you start standing in it. You begin to recognize that someone's inability to meet you emotionally isn't a reflection of your value. It's a reflection of their limits. And their limits are not your job to manage. It's natural to want to be chosen. It's deeply human to crave connection. But when that craving overrides your ability to choose yourself, you end up in relationships that ask you to shrink. You get stuck hoping that if you're just a little more patient, a little more understanding, a little less emotional, then maybe they'll come around. But avoidant people don't respond to how much you love them. They respond to how much you're willing to lose yourself to stay with them. And when you finally decide that you won't lose yourself anymore, when you draw the line and say, I won't sacrifice my emotional well-being just to be in this, you reclaim every ounce of power you thought they held over you. That's not easy. It takes strength to stop chasing. It takes courage to stop explaining yourself. It takes clarity to realize that the relationship you're trying to save might not be the one that can truly meet you. But that moment of clarity is the start of everything. Because when you stop trying to be chosen, you create space to choose. You choose peace over anxiety. You choose clarity over confusion. You choose truth over potential. And that choice doesn't make you hard or closed off. It makes you whole. You begin to relate to yourself differently. You speak up for what you need. You trust your intuition. You no longer see rejection as proof of your unworthiness, but as redirection towards something healthier. That's where true confidence comes from. Not from being wanted, but from knowing that you'll be okay even if you're not. That's the kind of energy that shifts everything. You stop begging to be seen and start seeing yourself. You stop hoping someone will finally stay and start choosing relationships where staying is never a question. Avoidants are often comfortable in dynamics where they don't have to fully show up. When you refuse to play that role anymore, you break the cycle. You may lose the relationship, but you gain yourself. And that is a win every single time. Because once you know your worth, once you felt the strength of walking away from inconsistency, you stop settling for scraps. You stop mistaking intensity for love. You stop fighting for people who are afraid to hold space for your depth. And you begin to attract what aligns with the version of you who no longer abandons herself. You realize you never had to be chosen by them to be enough. You just had to choose you. That's where your power has always been. And now you're finally using it.